Welcome everyone to another week of Ramban al Parsha. This week we have the great schos of reading Parshas Bo, and this week I want to do something slightly different. I want to start from the end of the Parsha, because the last Ramban on this week's Parsha, and in fact the last pasuk of this week's Parsha, is so fundamental both to seeing the philosophy of the Ramban and understanding the Ramban, and basically to understanding fundamentals of Judaism, of our religion. So we'll start there. We'll spend as much time as we need to understand the Ramban. If we have more time, we'll go back to the beginning of the Parsha. Okay? Let's start. Says the Torah at the end of the Parsha, Vayaki shalcha bincha machar lemor mazot, va'amarta elav b'chozek yad hotzianu adonai mitzrayim beit havadim, and tell him the story. Vahi ki kshaf arol shalchenu, vayarog adonai kol b'chor b'eretz Yisrael mi b'chor adam v'ad b'chor behima, Al kain ani zovech l'Adonai kol pet harechem hazicharim v'chol b'chol bonai efteh. V'haya la'ot al yadecha l'totafot bein einecha ki b'chozek yad hotzianu Adonai mitzrayim. So we of course know that as one of the sources for the mitzvah of tefillin. V'haya la'ot al yadecha l'totafot bein einecha, on your arm and on your head, right? You should put the parshios of tefillin and it will remind you. And of course that's the case, and that's the halacha. But the Ramban sees so much more here. And if we turn to the Ramban, it's a very, very long Ramban, so we won't read all of it inside. But says the Ramban on the last pasuk of this week's parsha, Hine, me'eit hayot avodat gilulim ba'olam bimei enosh, from the beginning of the world, right, in the time of Enosh, and you can see this all like the Rambam has in Hilchos Avodah Zarah, in the first parak, it's sort of like a concise history of Avodah Zarah, right? The question being, wait, Adam HaRishon knew that God created the world, so why did he have descendants who lived at the time that he was still alive, who thought otherwise? Adam HaRishon could have told them, yeah, there's a God. He created me, he created your mother, he created your grandmother, your great-great-grandmother, whatever it is, and he exists. So the Rambam there suggests that people knew there was a God, but because it's so difficult to worship, something that you can't see and that you can't sense, so they started worshiping planets and things like that as representatives of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Not that they mistook it, not that they thought that the moon had independent power and the sun had independent power, stars had independent power, but as a representative, as identifying God, they worshiped these things. And then over the generations, people forgot why they were worshiping them, and attributed to them independent power, and that's where Avodah Zarah started. Back to the Ramban. So he says, there were essentially three types of kofrim. He says, mehem kofrim bi'ikar, right, they're real kofrim, what we would think of as real kofrim, va'omrim ki ha'olam kadmon, right, these people thought to themselves, no, the world pre-existed. God, in fact, did not create the world, it pre-existed. Ki chashu b'Hashem, Vayomru lohu. That's a way of saying there is no God. There's no such thing as a God. Okay, that's the first group. Umehem makchishim bidiyato hapratit va'amru echa yeda el v'yesh de'al be'elyon. That there are those who said, yes, there's a God. He created the world. However, he doesn't know what's going on in the world. Right? He created the world, and then the world exists on its own. Yesh de'al, God doesn't know what we do. Okay, and then there's the third group. Umehem sheyodu biyidiyah. They admit God not only created the world, but he knows what goes on in the world. He has understanding of everything that we do. Umakchishim bahashkacha. However, they deny the fact that God is involved in this world, that God can exercise his will in this world, that God can change events as and if he sees the need to. Says the Ramban, it's not only the Ramban, this shows up in a number of places in different Rishonim. These are the three groups of kofrim. Again, one, they deny that God created the world completely. I think that's that's colloquially what we think is a kofar. Second, they deny God's knowledge of the world. Three, the third group, even if they admit that God created the world and they admit that God has knowledge of what goes on in the world, they don't think that God can intervene in the world. Okay, v'ya'asu adam kidige hayam, and we sort of exist like fish without divine providence ruling our lives. Shelo yashkiach hakel bohem ve'eni mahem onesh o sachar Yomru azav Hashem et haaretz. Right? This last group more or less say, yes, God created the world, but now the world is set up and the world runs according to pre-existing rules, and God has no involvement in the world or no interest in the world. V'ka'asher yirtza ha'elokim be'eda o b'yachid. V'ya'aseh imahem mofet b'shinui minhago shel olam v'tivo yitbarach l'chol bitul hadeyot ha'ela kulam. Says the Ramban, when God chooses a people, obviously chooses us, and he wants us to be aware of who he is and what he represents, so he's going to do something that will deny each of these three groups of kfira. Ki hamofet hanifla, when God does a miracle, moreh sheyesh one, la'olam elokam mechadsho. One, if you could change the rules of nature, it means you're the entity who created nature. It means you created the world. Two, v'yodea umashkiach v'yachol, and he knows exactly what goes on in the world, and he can intervene in the world. So basically, all three groups of kfira are denied or disproven by a miracle. And not only that, there are three groups of kfira. But what's the fourth thing that's necessary for people to believe in the Torah? Well, the fourth thing is obviously the authenticity of nevuah, that God communicates with human beings in this world. So says the Ramban, and when on top of those three things, the miracle was foretold by a prophet, Yitbarer mimenu od amitat hanevuah. That also proves that God communicates with humanity. Ki yidaber Elokim et ha'adam, v'yigales sodo el avodav haniviyim. Right? God reveals himself in advance to prophets. V'titkayem im zeh haTorah kula. So now, we've proven that the three groups are wrong. The group that thinks God didn't create the world, the group that thinks that God doesn't know what goes on in the world, and the group that thinks that God doesn't get involved in the world, all three are disproven, and they're disproven through the fourth critical element, and that is that God communicates with his chosen ones. God communicates with human beings, with prophets, as and when necessary. V'lachein, Yomar hakatuv b'moftim l'ma'an teida ki ani Hashem b'kerev haaretz. What does it mean, b'kerev haaretz? Lahorot al hahashkacha ki lo azav ota lemikrim kida'atam. Right? To let people know that God isn't leaving the world to chance. God controls the world and controls what goes on in the world. V'amar l'ma'an teida ki l'Hashem haaretz. Lahorot al hachidush. When it says l'ma'an teida ki Hashem haaretz, you're supposed to understand from that it proves that God created the world. Ki heim shelo shebara me'ayin. Because God owns us, literally. Why? Because he created us from nothing. Va'amar ba'avur teida ki ein kamoni b'chol haaretz. What's the difference between ein kamoni and ki ani Hashem b'kerev haaretz? Says the Ramban, lahorot al hayicholet shu shalit bakol, to prove God's omnipotence, that God can do whatever he wants, whenever he wants. Ein ma'akev biyado, ki b'chol zeh hayu hamitzrim makchishim o mistapkim. Says the Ramban, because in all these three areas, the Egyptians either didn't believe or they doubted. Imkain, okay, so 1 second. So says the Ramban again, there are three types of kfira in the world, and miracles disprove all three. On top of that, a miracle that was foretold in advance by a Navi proves that God communicates with human beings. And says the Ramban, the lashon of the psukim are meduyak. Ki ani Hashem b'kerev haaretz means I'm involved in the world. L'ma'an teida ki l'Hashem haaretz means that God created the world. And ki ein kamoni b'chol haaretz means I'm omnipotent. I can do anything I want. I control the world. Okay, so all miracles disprove the three categories of kfira. Imkain, ha'otot v'hamoftim hagidolim edim ne'emanim be'emunat haborei u'batorah kula. So therefore, miracles prove the existence of God. Great. So then why doesn't God do miracles all the time? Says the Ramban, and here's an important point. Uba'avur ki hakadosh baruch hu lo ya'aseh ot umofet b'chol dor le'enei kol rasha o kofer. Okay, God doesn't have to do miracles in every generation to disprove kofrim. In fact, it would undermine the mitzvah of emunah b'Hashem. It would undermine our belief in God if we had actual knowledge of God. Yes, we all want actual knowledge of God. What could be greater than meeting HaKadosh Baruch Hu and knowing that it's God Almighty and knowing the truth of His existence? But says the Ramban, HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't do that. He doesn't owe that to us. And I think what he really means is it would undermine the system of halacha and the system of our relationship with God if we knew that. I think Moshe Rabbeinu wasn't rewarded for belief in God. Moshe Rabbeinu knew God. But for the rest of us, we have belief. So since God doesn't do that, yitzaveh otanu shena'aseh tamid zikaron va'ot la'asher ra'u einenu. Because God's not going to make a miracle all the time, we have to establish mitzvos and remembrances of the miracle that He did. V'na'atik hadavar el baneinu ubnehem livnehem uvnehem l'dor acharon. That's how religion works. And we'll convey that to our children, and they'll convey that to their children, and they'll convey that to their children. V'hechmir ma'od bi'inyan hazeh kimo shechiyev karet ba'achilat chametz u'va'azivat ha'pesach. Since Yetziat Mitzrayim is so critical to who we are, to our history, and to our identity, right? This is also Sefer HaChinuch says this. There are many, many mitzvos with strict punishments that have to do with Yetzias Mitzrayim. Because we have to remember Yetzias Mitzrayim, because God's not going to do miracles in every generation. So the tefillin that were commanded in the last pasuk of this week's parsha, the tefillin are critical. When we put on tefillin, we're not supposed to just remember the Torah. We're supposed to remember the fact that Kadosh Baruch Hu took us out of Mitzrayim, and that's part of the remembrance of the mitzvah of tefillin. Okay, I'm skipping a bunch now. Okay, we'll skip a bunch, a few lines. And now says the Ramban, Ulefikach, Amru, Have Zahir b'mitzvah kala kivachahumura. Therefore, the Torah warns us, you have to be careful with mitzvahs that you consider to be simple, easy mitzvahs, and severe ones, and difficult ones. Shekulam chamudot v'chavivot ma'od. Because every mitzvah has its own reason, and every mitzvah is beloved by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu commanded us means lulav is as important as shatnez, is as important as matzah, is as important as tefillin, on a certain level. Shebechol sha'ah adam modeh bahen leilokav. Any mitzvah that I do, even an easy mitzvah, when I do it, I'm doing it because I believe in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu commanded me. And therefore, it's a form of acknowledging HaKadosh Baruch Hu's existence. And now the Ramban comes to a really, really important point. Says the Ramban, V'kavanat kol ha-mitzvot. He says the explanation, the rationale for every mitzvah. Shena'amin be'elokeinu v'nodeh elav shehu bara'anu. Right? The purpose of every mitzvah at core is that there's a God, and I'm acknowledging that that God created me. As a result, that God has the right to command me. Vihi kavanat hayitzira. That's the whole purpose of creation. And now maybe the most important philosophic point in any Ramban al Torah. Why did God create us? And says the Ramban, She'ein lanu ta'am acher biyitzira harishona. We have no other explanation for the creation of the world. Ve'ein el elyon chafetz batachtonim. And God has no interest in us, in His creations. Milevad sheyeda ha'adam v'yodeh leilokav shebira'o. The purpose of creation, says the Ramban, is that we can acknowledge God. And we can let people know that God exists and that God created the world. Now again, how does that work? Why doesn't God just make miracles? So this is a significant point. I want to be careful how I say it. The purpose of humanity, says the Ramban, is to acknowledge God, is to make God's name known in this world. Now, couldn't God do that himself? Of course he could. God could do anything. However, God has chosen to limit himself in this world. God made miracles. He made a miracle when he created the world. He made a miracle when he took us out of Mitzrayim. And as we'll see in the Ramban, he makes other miracles, daily miracles. But the open, broad, nisim giluyim, he's out of that business for now. Instead, he's transferred that responsibility to us. Right? The easiest thing in the world is for God to show up, and then we would believe in him. But God has given us that job. Ki'ilu, God limits himself in this world, and he limits his presence in this world, even though we would wish it would be otherwise. God has decided that he's not going to be an open presence in this world. However, he's made us, and he's told us, that's your job. Our job is to make God's name known in the world. And anytime we do a mitzvah, we're acknowledging the existence of God. Anytime we ask him for something, right? The bakashot in Shmona Esrei. That's the most important part of Shmona Esrei. Why? Because if, Rav Lichtenstein Zatzal said this, because if I ask God to heal me or to heal someone else, what I'm saying is, 1, I believe that God created the world. 2, I believe that God knows that this person has cancer, God forbid. And 3, I believe that God can intervene if he wants to. All that is encompassed in my simple Rifa'enu prayer. Every time I ask God for something, I'm saying God has the ability to give it to me. I'm saying that all these 3 things that the Ramban identified as points of doubt that the Egyptians had, I'm acknowledging them. And more than that, I'm letting everybody know that God exists. And that's our purpose in the world, says the Ramban. I'll read it again. Ein el elyon chafetz batachtonim milevad sheyeda ha'adam v'yodeh le'elokav shebera'o. Okay, and it's more than that. It's more than that. The Rav said this, I heard Rav Bick quote it. The Rav said, when you look at the simplest tefillah that we know, Adon olam Hashem malach b'terem kol yitzir nivra. Why does God need us? Well, God created the world, and why would he need us in the world? So the answer is because for God to be the melech, for God to be a king, he needs to have subjects. He needs to have subjects that acknowledge him. Le'eit na'asa b'chefzo kol, when everything comes into being through God's will, azai melech shmo nikra, then and only then can he truly be called a melech. Because ein melech b'lo am. God needs us to be his people so that he can be who he is. And let's continue now in the Ramban. V'kavanat, now this is a kind of a debatable or a questionable point of the Ramban. V'kavanat romemut hakol bitfilot, right? Davening out loud with a group of people. V'kavanat batei knesiyot uzchut tfilat harabim zehu. He said that's why we get together in shul. If I do it in my house, okay, I'm davening to God in my house. It's a davening. But it's not the same public statement of a group of people who get together and acknowledge, this is my God and my God is real and he exists. V'zeu, sheyihyeh livnei adam makom yitkabtzu v'yodu lakel shebira'am. Humanity will be able to get together and acknowledge God. V'himtziyam, and he made them. V'yfarsimu zeh, and they'll make it public. V'yamru lefanav, Briotecha anachnu, God, we are your creations. V'zo kavanatam b'ma she'amru zal v'yikru lekel elokim b'chazka. Right, in Nineveh, they cried out to God. They didn't just cry out to God. When they cry out to God, implicit in that is the acknowledgement that God created the world and created us and intervenes in the world and knows what's going on in the world. All those things are implicit in v'yikru el elokim b'chazka. Okay, perhaps this idea, the Ramban is saying that davening, b'tzibur in shul is some kiyum of a d'oraisa. It's hard to know exactly. Okay? And now we come to the next significant point in the Ramban. Maybe the most important or the most difficult. Says the Ramban, Umin hanisim hagidolim v'hamefursamim. Right, it's a famous line, gets quoted a lot. From the public great miracles, Adam modeh b'nisim hanistarim, shehem yisod haTorah kula. Just like, says the Ramban, there are big miracles. There's Kriyas Yamsuf, right? Who would doubt Kriyas Yamsuf? So when you recognize and acknowledge that God can do big public miracles, you have to recognize and acknowledge that God can do private miracles and subtle miracles. Shehem Yisod HaTorah Kula. Says the Ramban, the private subtle miracles, they're the foundation of the entirety of the Torah. And then you get to a really hard line. She'ein la'adam chelek b'torat Moshe Rabbeinu. We have no portion of the Torah ad she'na'amin b'chol dvareinu u'mikrenu she'kulam nisim ein bahem teva u'minhago shel olam bein b'rabim bein b'yachid. Says the Ramban, literally, although I don't think he means it literally, and there are other Rambans that contradict this, there is no such thing as nature. There's God's will. And things happen quietly, but they're miracles. So for example, right, we say in Shema every day, if Vayam Shema Tishmos, right, then v'natatim etaretzechem be'ito re'el malkosh. So says the Ramban, wait, what's the natural connection between if I keep the Torah, if I obey God, He's going to make it rain? And Chas v'shalom the opposite. What is it that if I sin, He's going to v'atzar mitar hashemayim v'lo yem atav v'adama lo titein tivula? Why? Says the Ramban, that's a miracle. Right? There's nothing that connects the two. That shows that HaKadosh Baruch Hu runs the world. Now, people will notice when it happens to Am Yisrael over and over again, people will see it and they'll acknowledge it. But most importantly, we have to acknowledge it. If we're in a drought, we have to acknowledge it's not just mikra. It's not just a coincidence. It's the fact that we're doing something wrong. And God forbid, if we're doing something wrong, we have to fix it. Ella, says the Ramban, Im ya'aseh ha-mitzvot yatzlichenu secharo. If we do the mitzvos, then great, God will reward us. Vim ya'avor alehem yachritenu ansho, then he'll cut us off. Hakol b'gzeirat elyon kasher hizkarti kfar. Everything is dependent on the will of God, says the Ramban. Okay, so we did a lot in this Ramban. Let's just review quickly. There are three groups of kofrim, okay? And says the Ramban, God makes an open, obvious miracle, a nes nigla in Mitzrayim, to prove them all wrong. And it's meduyak in the psukim, the way God is described in the psukim. 1 tells you He created the world. 2 tells you He's involved in the world. 3 tells you that He controls the world. He continues to be interested in the world. All that by way of a Navi, proving that God communicates with human beings. Okay, then we come to the next big point of the Ramban, which is the purpose of creation. Why does God need human beings? And says the Ramban, I think he really means it literally, God needs human beings to make Him more present in the world, to make Him exist. Rav Amital Zatzal used to say, he always described the Holocaust as a big chilul Hashem. So he asks himself, what does it mean a chilul Hashem? We did something wrong, God forbid, and that's why we were punished? No, he said, it's a chilul Hashem in the sense that who in the world respected the God of the Jews during the Holocaust? Nobody. Likewise, or in the opposite direction, the founding of the state of Israel, said Rav Amital Zatzal, was a Kiddush Hashem. Why? Was there some open miracle? No, says Rav Amital. When God returned to the historic stage, people respected the God of the Jews more. Literally, the Holocaust made God smaller and less present in the world. And the founding of the state of Israel and the continued success of the state of Israel makes God more present in the world. We have, as revolutionary as it sounds, or maybe as crazy as it sounds, we have an impact on God's presence in the world. The more that we're God aware, the more that we make brachos out loud, the more that we acknowledge God, the more that we keep the Torah, it's not just for us. Kiviyachol, we're doing God a favor by making him more present in the world. Yes, he could have done it himself, but he chose not to. He chose to make himself bound by certain rules that we're bound by. To be a father, you need a son. To be a husband, you need a wife. To be a wife, you need a husband. They're linguistic needs, but they're also real needs. Says HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to be melech over the whole world, you need people to acknowledge you. That's our role in the world. And therefore, says HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I don't make miracles all the time. And again, I'm convinced that God doesn't make miracles all the time because he wants us to believe in him. He doesn't want us to know him. You know, if God appeared and made a miracle, so we would know him, but then we wouldn't have emunah. We would have yediyah. And those are two different things. And God wants us to have yediyah. And finally, the key line, when the Ramban says, you know, mina nisim hagdolim mefursamim, adam modeh minisim hanistarim. Right? The Ramban thinks the whole world works on a nes nistar. In some, you know, strange way, the Ramban would say, if I let go of this Tanakh and it falls, that's a miracle. As if there's no such rule of gravity. There's just every time it happens, you know, you can assume that that's how God's going to react. Whether that's really the Ramban's shita or not is a much more complicated question. But the idea the idea exists that everything that happens out of hashgacha pratis, happens out of divine providence, and the more that we're good, then God will make it rain. Not just literally rain, God will bring good things to us. God will be good to us. God will make us a chosen people. People will look at the Jewish people and respect them. And when they respect the Jewish people, they'll respect HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the God who created the world and who created the Jewish people. Okay, we have a few minutes, but let's stop here. We did only one Ramban today, but I think it was hopefully worth the price of admission. Shabbat Shalom, and see you next week.